So, hello everybody. I'm Ajoy Datta, and I'm an associate on think tanks. I'm a manager, researcher, facilitator, and I'm interested in management and change. So, in this session, we're talking about ethics and organizational partnerships. I'm joined by Alba Gómez, and she's the Deputy Director for Strategic Partnerships at the European Council on Foreign Relations. So in a moment, I'll ask Alba to give a brief talk, around 10 minutes, where she'll give an introduction to the European Council on Foreign Relations and then talk about the process and principles to forming partnerships. I'll then step up onto the stage with Alba and I'll have a conversation with her lasting about 20 minutes. And we'll talk about, we'll discuss some issues from her talk, going into some examples perhaps. It'll last about 20 minutes, and then after that, we'll invite all of you to join the stage proverbially, and ask questions, comments, and sort of provide insights as they emerge. So that's how this session is structured, fairly straightforward. And if you have any comments whilst we're talking, particularly during the first part, please use the chat box. And as I say, during the conversation that we have with you, all of you watching us, if you want to join us, please do request your audio and video, and we'll sort of we'll say yes, we'll accept the request and invite you onto the stage so we can see and hear you. So that would be great. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Alba.
Thank you, Joy. And thank you all for joining this session. I think it's great to be here today to discuss such an important topic. First, as mentioned by Joy, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to ECFR. I know that most of you here, you know what a think tank is, but it will help us understand some of the challenges and dilemmas that we're going to be looking through later on. This is because the ECFR is not the typical national leading think tank in a country, but we're the only pan-European foreign policy think tank in Europe, and we have 7 offices across the continent. This gives us great advantages because we are really aware of and we have good access to the national conversations and national agendas and networks throughout the whole of Europe. However, sometimes it can also give us some issues because we're not considered French enough or German enough for certain funding opportunities, especially on topics like security and defense, that countries are a bit more reserved about those. So I think it's important to understand that distinction. Also, as an organization of our type, we can be under pressure because we don't have an endowment. So our core funder gives us around 1/4 of our annual funding. So we need to watch very closely the market. And when the markets get tightened, then it can be quite a scary position for us. One example of this is when in Italy, the narrative in the political system was going against Europe. It's quite difficult to have an office in Rome in that momentum. So I think this context is quite relevant for the conversation on partnerships, on funding, on the ethics of those partnerships. And one key element of this is how think tanks can stay innovative. I think that for this, it's very obvious that think tanks would need core funding. And there is a shift. Some foundations like the Robert Bosch Stiftung, they have gone from very project detailed funding to core funding. And that really helps to give think tanks the space to think and be innovative and deal with late minute issues. Also, the Open Society Foundation is another foundation that, as noted by Goran Buljowski, the head of OSF here in Berlin, promotes and even asks other funders to give not only project funding, but also core funding. I think this is important to understand before we go into the processes and principles of accepting gifts, because they can be quite different one from the other. I'm going to run you now through what are the key areas that we looked at ECFR when we're forming partnerships and accepting gifts. The first element is the share value with our partners. So we place great importance in our independence, but at the same time, we like to take advantage of our funders and do partnerships with them. This is as Ruth was saying earlier, we shouldn't be shy and thinking that we're just selling a product, but we also have a lot of potential to bring to the relationship. Therefore, it's really important that we don't undersell ourselves. And if you want a successful partnership, an ethical one, you need to share the same values. If not, you can see that it's just not going to work. That is one of the key elements. The second one is the importance of the truth, not only for our partners, but also for our audiences. And this we find is a key ethical requirement that we should be providing as a think tank, even more than ever now with the rise of misinformation and fake news. This is why at ECFR since 2019, we're engaging in vast amounts of polling around Europe. We find that the data doesn't substitute workshops and discussions, but allows to have better informed debates and better and more inclusive policy recommendation as a result. For us, this is the most ethical way forward nowadays. Another key element is to keep your independence and transparency. We already discussed a little bit on the keynote, but I think it's important to reiterate two things. On the independence, you need to be ready to walk out. We have in the past received funding for projects that then the donor hasn't really agreed with the policy recommendations of our researchers. You need to stand by them, and you need to be ready to not receive that line of funding again if it happens. And on transparency, as Ruth Levin was saying, it should be imperative that we disclose funding, names from the donors, amounts, to what project they give you the money. It's a bit of a small dilemma with data privacy to your donor, but it's an even bigger deal to comply with the interest to inform the public about where the funding comes from and towards what project is going. At the same time, it's very important for think tanks to have this process and guidelines on accepting gifts, but you need to inform all of your staff about it. You need to make sure that it's always better to have 4 pairs of eyes on something. So you need to look at the percentage of that funding and how big is that percentage compared to the program, for example, or even to the whole organization if it's a large funder. Because diversity can give you a lot of independence. One funder can give you more flexibility, but it's also riskier. So you always need to, from a management perspective, you need to keep all of those things in mind when you're accepting gifts. Another couple of things that we're doing. So we are indeed, as Ruth was saying, diversifying funding. So we have 4 sorts of categories on foundations, government, corporations, and individuals. Mostly the governments are European and Scandinavians, but it's quite important to have a broad base in this sense when possible. Obviously, think tanks that have been around for 50 years have an advantage of those that are 5 years old. In addition to using data to be more inclusive, we also try to diversify voices. So, for example, we encourage conversations from people from all political parties around Europe, and we try to represent different voices in every country we're in. And last, which is something that I'm hoping every think tank is doing, is to really research your funders. It sounds very obvious, but in whichever position you're in, you need to do a thorough research, especially when it's new funders that you're not so sure about. Because even if you're in a tough funding situation that year, a damage to your reputation could be irreversible. So this is really important. We try to do due diligence on all of our funders and their activities to make sure that we avoid those issues, but it's quite an important thing still to mention. And finally, just as a closing remark here, I think one thing is to have the guidelines, but what is truly important is to work them internally. So do your staff know about them? Do they understand them? Do you make them publicly available? Is it part of the onboarding package? I think it's really important that on think tanks is promoting an issue like this. I think it's vital to keep the sector at the highest integrity level, so all of our products are taken seriously, especially when fake news and misinformation are on the rise. The integrity and the ethics of research, of policy papers, of funding, those are key ingredients for the sector to ensure that we live by the highest standards, which is what think tanks should be aiming for. And Ajoy, these are my opening remarks. So happy to now go more into examples and challenges and dilemmas to put all of this theory more into practice.
Great. No, thank you, Alba. That was a really nice introduction. Yeah, so I guess you've set out these really interesting principles, and I wonder if we can start the conversation around sort of maybe an example you can provide in terms of how you kind of put this into practice.
Sure. So for one example, in my current organization, for example, it's Poland. As I'm sure you're all aware, it's not exactly the most pro-EU government at the moment, but we have an office in Warsaw. In most cases, we tend to work with governments and ministries of foreign affairs and policymakers to showcase our policy recommendations. We cannot do that in Poland. At the same time, most of the funding comes from Germany. So our work there is seen not as local, but as a foreign agency, if we can say it that way. In this case, I think it's important to keep your work there, to not lose that communication channel. It will be easier in a way to you close that office and then you move to the places where you have the funding and the willingness to work with you. And we don't do that. So it's definitely a difficulty, a challenge, but you have to keep it going. The same in Italy, for example, maybe a couple of years ago, it was looking a bit worse than now. So we have had those issues when the political will is just not in line with our values. And yeah, it's tricky, but you continue working and you also try to bring others into the table. So in the case of Poland, you try to bring Germany to the table and try to do round discussions with a few others and move things forward when possible.
Great. What comes to mind is what you said during your initial opening remarks. You talked about, you need to be ready to walk out. And I was wondering, I was thinking about sort of, the context for this is the relationship with funders is often very transactional. They give you something, money, resources, and you give them something in return. And I suppose that really, that's perhaps at the core of the relationship. But I'm just wondering, is there anything beyond that? Is there space within in the relationship, within the partnership to, because I think you mentioned, you were drawing on something that Ruth mentioned, that, you can bring other things to the partnership, and perhaps the funder can bring other things beyond money to the partnership as well. And I was also thinking about sort of, the fact that people often have differences, so when it comes to that initial transaction that might be sort of institutionalized in a contract, there might be sort of differences which didn't emerge at the beginning, but do so through, during the process.
Yeah.
And you'll have a certain need, which, you'll have certain needs in terms of the process, which you might be fearful of actually expressing because you're wondering whether the funder will be happy about it. They might walk away themselves. They might say, well, actually, we don't want to give you money for it. So I was just wondering, to what extent are you able to actually express your needs in sort of this funding, this sort of slightly transactional relationship, given that fear that they might walk away, they might not give you the money. But also, if you don't express your needs, then you might not necessarily be sort of adhering to your values, and what you think is right, or the best way forward.
Yeah, I think in that process with the partnerships, we have a few different ways of dealing with this. On one side, in our team, on the strategic partnerships team, we don't see it as fundraising. We don't see it as a transaction on the I sell you something, but we all bring something to the table. But obviously, because of the type of organization that we are, then the funders will put the money, but then we'll carry the activities with them in some cases. At the same time, I think an organization really needs to have the communications between the teams. In our case, the research director, whenever we go into new grants, he will also make sure, together with the senior director for strategic partnerships, that this is not compromising our independence. So I think it's a common effort to make sure from our side that we are still working on the areas that we want to in a way that we feel comfortable. It's a lot easier, we have found, when the partnerships are long-lasting partnerships that we have had for, let's say, 5 years now, because then there is a better communication with the donor. It can be a bit trickier on the new funder, first time you're working together. We've definitely seen more issues in those ones. I think in the other ones, one of the things that we try is to always be in touch with the donors, keep them aware of what we're doing and how that process of the partnership is going. When it's the first time, then yeah, it can be a bit trickier, which is why many times we start with smaller projects for the first time. I think then with time we build onto bigger partnerships, and even strategic partnerships, they only arrive probably after a few years and a certain level of funding. So we have certain guidelines sort of that we follow to avoid those issues, but they still happen, and I think it's normal. It's just easier when you're in a better funding situation to raise the red flags and not just feel like you're working for the funder, but for your mission.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose, yeah, you mentioned sort of the word communication, and I was just thinking, at its core, these sort of institutional or organizational partnerships between these big organizations, at its core, it's about a relationship between people,
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess, I was just wondering, sort of, can you tell us a bit more about sort of a particular instance where, you've been working with other people, perhaps in your offices, you've got the funder, you might have some other sort of entities involved. I wonder if you can just provide a bit more detail, some examples on sort of who's involved, what's going on, what are you talking about, some of the complications that might sort of emerge, some of the dilemmas that you might be facing.
Sure. On the first point, and this was quite key, I think, on the way that I see fundraising, people give to people. So I totally agree on that assessment that is based on personal relationships, and we see that all throughout the capital. So this doesn't change from one country to the other. On difficulties when we bring quite a lot of people into the same table, we definitely have a lot of those. For example, if we're working on European sovereignty, for example, and we publish some papers on that, and then we're having a roundtable discussion with the donors, we hear criticism and we accept it. It doesn't mean that we change our policy recommendations. It's just we let them have a voice and express why they don't agree with some of the things we're saying, but it varies very much between countries. So what France might find that is not a good policy recommendation, Germany might find it great, and at the end of the day, that's where we draw the line, and that is our work. So it is a bit of a dilemma because you could be pleasing some funders and really upsetting others at the same time, and you just have to go with that and accept it. You could give your logic for those policy recommendations or the data that you based it in and how you got to that decision. But at the end of the day, I think funders even value that. I think as long as you have good background and a strong research and good researchers that can go stand behind the recommendations, then I think funders are also aware that they're giving you the funding and that you're an independent institution. So those issues are sometimes mitigated with that.
Mm-hmm. I suppose I'm really interested in sort of this idea that you're often working across national boundaries. And, I guess within your organization, you've got different offices across different countries, and then funders might be from yet other countries. So I'm just wondering, what does that mean for your communication? And, particularly how you work together and what you're used to in terms of expectations. I guess what comes to mind is sort of, national stereotypes, which can be, incredibly destructive. And, they suggest that, different people from different countries behave in certain manners, in certain ways, which, obviously we're all unique, we're all different anyway, but I just wonder if you can, have you spotted, I wonder if you can say anything about that.
Yeah, plenty. We have plenty of examples. We feel it's one of the things that makes us richer, not only our broad council, but the national offices. But at the same time, and we have a communications team that oversees like all of the communications strategy, but then in every office, then they take care of their national communications part. From the partnerships perspective, we take completely different approaches from one city to the other one. Because what in Madrid might be resolved over a 2-hour lunch, in France you need to have, so it's completely different from one country to the other, including even the applications and the context. At the end of the day, we keep the projects the same, but how we deal with them varies a lot. We have, when we put all of these people together on different roundtables, there is what I consider very rich discussions, but also people trying to bring in their personal messages from each capital, and then trying to find the middle ground between all of those can sometimes be very tricky. but very fun at the same time. So it's, in my opinion, it's a great advantage, and it's one of the main reasons that I like this think tank. But yeah, it comes with certain difficulties sometimes.
And you mentioned that different people from different countries are bringing their personal messages, and reconciling them is quite difficult. Can you just elaborate what you mean by personal messages?
Not personal from themselves, but maybe from their government or from companies in different. We have some corporates that maybe we get money from the branch in Spain, but then the second that we do a bigger round table, and then there is also the branch in Italy, they even have themselves different priorities. So when you're having a discussion on regulating the internet, and you have different opinions coming from even the same donor, it's quite enriching. It really enriches the conversation, but it's trickier.
So how do you reconcile that then? Because I guess everyone's bringing different interests. They're trying to further, as you say, their governmental interests, aren't they?
Yeah.
So how do you negotiate that?
I mean, we don't negotiate it exactly, but I think that's when you need great moderators in every panel and roundtable discussion that you have. And at the end of the day, if you have, it depends on the style of workshop. If you have a food for thought paper before, then you could always go back to that and then make this context clear to all of them. When the policy brief, for example, comes after a series of roundtables of discussions, then that's when it's up to the researcher and the data and all the conversations for us as ECFR to pick what we think would be the best for the greater good of whatever that policy recommendations are looking at. So it's both a before and after sort of work. In the moment, I think we just try to bring the best out of each idea that we have across the table.
I'm interested in what you said about the need to have good moderators. I suppose, I guess I was wondering sort of what kind of skills a good moderator might need to have to be able to negotiate and reconcile all these sort of differences. So I was wondering if you can reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think you need to be really open to the new ideas, because by moderators, most times we have our own researchers. So whatever ideas you came into this workshop with thinking, maybe this is the path that we should follow, I think you really need to be very open to hearing all of the other points of view and accepting those as they might be really useful for your papers. Finding conciliation between people on those roundtables is also quite tricky. So I think when working for think tanks, sometimes a psychology degree is a fantastic thing to have as a background. I think that really helps with moderating panels. And I think in general, probably the experience of a few years doing this, as Ruth was saying, many of think tankers, they are researchers 3 days a week, and then 2 other days of the week, they're policy advisors for X amount of governments. I think once you've been in that sort of line of work for X amount of years, then you know how to find compromises between the people around the table. And that's what I think good moderators are really good at trying to do whenever the round table gets really tough and people are really disagreeing with each other, then I think that's quite key.
Yes, yeah, that's interesting. This issue around having a psychology degree, so really knowing how people function, and being able to sort of know when there's an issue that's going on between people, and when it might just be you. So just sort of separating out. And also separating out what might be other people projecting stuff onto you as a leader from what is actually happening in you. So I think, sort of knowing yourself and knowing other people, I think there's sort of the social element and sort of the psychological element. That's really useful. Thank you, Alba. I guess there's a few questions building up in the chat box. I wonder if we can turn our attention to that.
Okay.
Yeah. So if there are if there are people who want to come onto the stage, perhaps, please do make a request, and we'll gladly accept. Maybe we can work our way through the questions in the chat box first. So Lucas asks, what's included in your due diligence of funders? What are the most important things to know about them? How do you find out? Yeah.
Sure. That's a lot of research, basically. So I think, as I mentioned, our due diligence sort of process includes things like values and transparency, but at the same time, we need to make sure that what the funding is for, it's aligned with our core mission. So we obviously have work plans, and you need to make sure that the funding is for those reasons, that you're not just selling something else like a consultancy to the donor. When it comes to researching the funders, I think it's really important to look at what sorts of activities they're doing and where. In some cases, a corporate could be giving you funding for one line of work, but then on a different area, be doing something that goes completely against everything that you stand for. So I think you need to have a really good overview of what they do. In this case, I find it usually helps to build, I like to have, before we sign agreements with funders, I like to have extensive conversations with them about what their interest is in forming a partnership with us. Because then you can hear a lot about what their goals are and what the priorities are for the year. And in some cases, it's great because they really align. So we have some digital project that has been going on for years about Europe's digital power. How can Europe be more active on certain items that we've been surpassed by the US and China? And the partners that we have, they bring amazing expertise to the table. But you only know that once you sit and you talk to them about it. So on the due diligence, I think you need to, and always bring an extra pair of eyes. Whenever it's a new donor and you're not sure about it, follow your gut feeling and do proper research, talk to them about it. Do not be shy to ask questions about what are your activities in X country, even if it's not related to the funding that you're receiving. I think that's important to know.
Mm-hmm. So just a follow-up question, I was interested, you mentioned that you ask partners why they're wanting to partner with you, and I was just wondering if you can give us some examples as to why some funders want to partner with you.
Yeah, because I think in order to build a better partnership, it's really important to know what they're expecting from you, and then what you can expect from them as well. So I like to go to meetings and listen more than talk, for that exact reason. Because I think if you really listen, then you really get why they want to partner with you, what they need from you, and it gives you a better perspective on how your work can help them. If I understand the structure or the challenges that a foundation is looking at, then I can see if the project that we're actually discussing is the best idea or not. We might have something else or research from someone else in the organization that could be even more relevant. And then you bring that person into the conversation. So I think starting by asking your funders those kind of questions is key to offering them the best that your think tank can offer.
Okay. And I was just thinking about this sort of due diligence and doing proper research. I mean, what does that sort of entail? Does that mean sort of, finding people who they've worked with before and sort of asking them questions?
You can definitely do that.
Process, isn't that?
Yeah, you can definitely. I think that the think tank community in a way is quite small in Europe. So you can definitely find former colleagues or staff that work in think tanks that are funded by them, and you can inquire. You could definitely look on their website. If there is something that could be problematic, it will most likely be on the news. So you can look through news relating this company or government or foundation, and then find, the internet is such a good source of everything that if you get into a bit of stalking mode and you really look into what they've been up to, then you can find most of the things that you need probably to know if it's a good case to go forward with or not.
Okay. Great. So let's return to the chat box. Francesco Urbino, question for Alba. What about partnerships with non-donor organizations? How different are the challenges you face, including on the agenda setting front?
Yeah. So at ECFR, we mostly do these types of partnerships whenever it's a topic that we don't have all the expertise. So for example, on climate, we're working more and more on the topic, but we still feel we like to partner with people that have been doing this for a lot longer than us to cover those areas better. In terms of challenges, it's obviously a lot easier when you already have the funding aligned and then you just partner with someone else to complete the project. we also have we have a great idea with another organization that is not a donor, and then we look for funding together. I think the most important thing here to avoid issues is to set all the parameters at the beginning before you have the funding. So how will we split it? And not only in terms of money, but how will you split the workload? Who will do what on their side? Who will do what on our side? I think once you have transparency on all of this, and then you go for funding, then you avoid issues. So this is definitely something that we do, but only on those topics that we don't feel comfortable doing on our own. For the rest, we still, we don't tend to partner that much with our other organizations. On the agenda setting front, it has to be something that we want to pursue. So we have organizations contacting us because they want to work on X topic, and having a CFR would be super helpful. But unless it's within our agenda goals of that year, or we see the benefit of adding it, then we tend to try to stick to the main working areas, because so much happens during the year. I mean, health, for example, wasn't in our work plan for 2020, health sovereignty for Europe. And it became a core issue of our work because of COVID and the context. So I think we still need to be able to fulfill our work plan and add what is happening in the world, and still partner with other organizations on new topics. So the agenda, we do try to keep our work plan to what we consider as a priority of the year, instead of having others come to us and asking us to join them. It's a capacity issue as well. We need to make sure we keep our staff and don't overwork people.
Great, okay. So Regine asks, what aspects of partnerships do you value the most? Apart from trust and core funding provided by funders, what else are you interested in?
Yeah. I think in partnerships, there is a few things that we really care about. Once we pass the threshold of sharing the same values, and at some point, even the same sort of goals or mission, like that we all agree we want, for example, very vague, a stronger Europe, then the sharing of expertise. I think we greatly value when our partners want to discuss with us a paper, or they want to participate in a roundtable that is not part of the project that they fund. Funders, especially the large ones, they tend to have a staff in many different areas. So what I try to encourage my contacts in some foundations or in governments is, I'll send you invites that might not be related to what you're funding and what we're talking about, but feel free to send me your person working on Russia, for example, to this roundtable, because then it enriches the conversation. So I think that is one of the key things that in partnerships we really value. We also, this year, for example, we've been super grateful to the flexibility of our funders. I think COVID brought so many challenges to organizations like ours, and we've seen funders being really flexible, understanding that in-person events couldn't happen, but instead we could do some research and promote it with an online debate. And that really made us feel that our funders are on our side and really trying to help us. So that was quite a really nice thing that COVID brought within that context. So expertise, flexibility, and I think the trust to bring new issues with us, it's always also really helpful. So new project ideas have come from funders on topics that we were already thinking about doing, and we were thinking of a format, and then funders came with a suggestion, and it turned out to be fantastic suggestions. So we've been really lucky in that sense with many of our partners. Yep. You're muted. I cannot unmute you. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just thinking about collaboration, and I was thinking about sort of your work, particularly with non-donor organizations. So I suppose there isn't necessarily an obvious transaction going on there. And so I sort of came across a sort of a framework of sort of what collaboration really means in practice. I was saying it means being able to engage in dialogue, sort of conversation, means being able to improvise. So not necessarily being goal-oriented, not necessarily knowing where the conversation is going to go, where the sort of the partnership's going to lead. And something about sort of caring as well, because we're talking about ethics. And I suppose a large part of ethics is about caring for the other. And I suppose caring kind of partly means being able to sort of walk in someone else's shoes to know how they're thinking and feeling, and what that means for how you work with them, and how you might frame things, how you talk to them. So yeah, I'm just wondering if any of that sort of resonates, the dialogue, improvising, particularly in a context where, you feel you need to get things done, goals need to be met, targets need to be met, and you've only got finite time to achieve it all in, and yeah, I guess the word care doesn't really come up in conversation a lot. Caring for others is seen as a lovey-dovey thing, maybe between sort of intimate partners, but we don't think of it in a sort of in an official sense, in a formal sense, but we really do need to care if we are going to be ethical. So yeah, I don't know if any of that resonates with you.
Yeah, it completely does, and not only with non-donor organizations, but also with our donors. And I think if anything, this year with Corona highlighted that even more. We have had cases in which we know that the funding case is just not there anymore because of what has been going on with the economy, and we still have placed greatest importance in caring about how our donors are doing, or our partners, or other organizations that we work with, and if there is anything we can do to help. So I think it's not all about a transaction with money. It's about those partnerships and these people that you have been working with for sometimes many years and sometimes only a few months, but you're in such a situation now that you care about how they're doing and you value the work that they do, whether it's similar to yours or completely different. And I don't think that is discussed enough, especially in ethics. And I think that is probably one of the most ethical, but also the minimum that you should do as a person, as an employee of a think tank, and just as a colleague as well. So yeah, I think it's a bigger discussion to include that word more in this kind of chats. Oh, boundary crossers. Oh, you're muted.
All right. I was wondering about this idea of improvisation as well. So, this idea that, projects have to have goals, meetings need to have agendas. We need to get through them in a certain period of time, but in the end, some of the best things aren't really planned for, sometimes the best things sort of emerge. I suppose improvisation, another way of saying it is to sort of make it up as you go along, but that never goes down very well. If you don't have a plan, it's not good, So particularly in a partnership, I don't know if you can say a little bit about that or not.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think some of the best discussions many times happen in coffee breaks. And those are the improvised conversations that you have outside of the super filled agenda to follow. And in our case, we have our main event once a year, every June, and I'm always looking forward to it because the agenda is fantastic, and so are the speakers. But then the side conversations that you have on all the breaks or during the dinner, and the people that you get to meet that you might otherwise not do, that's when the best project ideas actually come from. I had a chat with someone for half an hour, and we thought that this really aligns with what they're doing. So I think there has to be more spaces for improvisation. I've seen some events when the coffee breaks are actually longer than the sessions because they actually want people to talk about. And it seems a bit odd to go to a 30-minute session with a 1-hour coffee break, but it really works. Obviously depends on if people are there with their laptops working or not, but we do tend to have some formats that allow for improvisation. So we try to do foreign policy salons or dinners in which the general topic might be there, or you might have like a keynote speaker on 10 minutes talking about something, but then the next 2 hours are quite free to develop as people around the table want to. I think it's a bit more difficult when it's large crowds. So when you have 100 people in one big conference, I think that makes it a bit trickier for improvisation. I'm a huge fan of breakout rooms when there is 15 of us and we can actually talk about different topics. That's much better.
Yeah, interesting. I think we've sort of, as a society, I think we've sort of lost the ability to to think as a large group. So when it comes to large groups, I think we often rely on sort of an individual to sort of provide a lead, to structure the conversation. We need an agenda. And it seems as if we feel safer to express ourselves in much smaller groups. Let's go back to the chat box. Regine's got another question. Comment. Ruth Levine talked about think tanks as boundary crossers. Think tanks act as public intellectuals on one day, and on the next day they act as private advisors to policymakers. Making sure that they're not drawn to one side too much is the key. Can you share how ESFR manages to find the right balance?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a very thin line to walk through. We pride ourselves on our access to policymakers and networks, and we don't have an office in Brussels on purpose because we want to have the national conversations from every country without being based in that bubble. At the same time, we do bi-weekly meetings on a staff on policy. So it's not a discussion on funding or on communications, but it's solely based on our policy ideas and policy recommendations and who are we talking to about. One of the goals this year with the polling is to include more voices and diversify voices and include people's opinions. So we're still, I think every think tank, every year, you're trying to strike the right balance between your influence and your outreach to policymakers and being connected with people. I think in Europe, it's been one of the biggest issues, the disconnection between policymakers, politicians, and population. So I think we're somewhere in the middle, trying to, with the polling, really get to know what people think, asking questions, for example, in Germany, and what do you think of the US election, or who do you dislike most between the US and China? So I think it's a tricky balance to keep, and probably doing a set of things such as polling and talking to policymakers, but also to other civil society organizations in your country can be the best way to sort of stay somewhere in the middle, which is where I think that think tanks should be.
Mm-hmm.
But tricky, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I think Enrique is talking about improvising working well for the long-term, for long-term unrestricted funding. So organizations being able to experiment where they had sort of the funding base to do that, rather than meeting particular targets for specific projects, I suppose.
Yeah, but that is meant to be the goal of think tanks, to be innovative, to have the space to think. So I think by long-term funding, I would also sort of attach that to core funding, because then it lets you work on the latest issues of the day. So like this year, when the global pandemic hit, we could use some long-term unrestricted funding to work on health sovereignty for Europe. If we didn't have that, then we wouldn't have been able to. So I think it's key for think tanks to have that sort of ability, so that you can respond to the latest issues that are most important at that time. But yeah, you definitely need long-term unrestricted funding for that.
Yeah. And on the issue, on a sort of linked issue of improvising, Kathleen says, fully agree with the importance of coffee breaks, which is why this COVID pandemic makes it so hard to be creative and improvise. So that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I suppose how has, and you touched on it earlier, but in terms of the lack of, the travel restrictions, the physical distancing, the lack of sort of in-person time with your counterparts, whether they're funders or non-funders, what is that? Can you say something about what that's done to sort of your sense of relatedness to these other people, and what that's done to the partnership?
I think on one side, it places the greatest challenge on building new partnerships. I think you have some tools like coffee breaks to continue the ones that you already have, and thanks to technology, you have many ways of staying in touch with partners. We are trying within the restrictions to stay in touch with colleagues. So sometimes we do virtual lunches, and then we just meet there. We in the first lockdown, one of my colleagues was doing yoga sessions on Fridays. So we all saw each other there. So I think with colleagues, we have different ways of doing it. With partners, we still, because so much is going on and the projects need so much attention, that we have managed quite well to stay in touch. But where I've really seen it difficult is on the personal relationships that you build from scratch. So the new people that you meet at all of these events. I have yet, and I will definitely try the expo section, to meet new potential funders that you start engaging in a conversation about what a potential partnership could look like, or what you have to offer, or for them to tell you what they're working on. That, I think, is the biggest downside of Corona for this topic, obviously. But yeah, I think we need to keep trying to innovate until the situation gets a bit better. I think hybrid events might be I mean, not now that we're all on proper lockdown, but at least our hope for early 2021 is that we can do hybrid formats. So at least those in Berlin can meet in one room, those in Paris can meet in the other one, and then online we sort of do the joint conversation. That is what we're hoping for next. So to avoid traveling, but still see each other.
Interesting. I mean, I suppose when it comes to sort of all these virtual conversations we're having, it's when some of them would be happening sort of in person, it's really hard to know sort of what, because in some senses, you know, earlier I was talking about like saying difficult things with funders and perhaps other people. Sometimes, you know, having that sort of distance in some ways, you know, physical distance might give you a bit more courage to say more difficult things, perhaps, you know. I guess it's drawing on this idea that, you know, you have a slightly sort of higher degree of anonymity, perhaps, which might sort of give you more courage to say difficult things. But then, so it's hard to know sort of what you're able to say that you weren't able to say before, and also what's lost, because, you know, there are certain things which emerge from embodied conversation, sort of in-person conversation. You know, this goes back to sort of the improvisational aspect, you know. You just don't know until you actually meet, and things will emerge. There's sort of, you know, we talk about chemistry.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, it's hard to know what, you know, we can't say anymore because we don't have the sort of accountability.
A lot of the message can get lost if it's online. I'm a huge fan in that sense of picking up the phone. Even if it might be more difficult to say difficult, I find it easier to say difficult things speaking, because then you can also really explain yourself. That over email, I'm always, when it comes to difficult opinions, it's a bit, you're always a bit worried that the person might not get the message or might take it wrong. You don't know the reaction. So on those cases, I always prefer you pick up the phone and you call. If it's on Teams, when we're having conversations like that, we always try to put on the camera. So we've all seen everyone's walls and kitchens. But I think that really helps to keep that sort of energy that you might have if you weren't doing it in person. If you're going to say something difficult in person, you would try to say it politely and nicely so the person doesn't feel offended. I think the same applies even in lockdown and using chats and phone calls and things like that.
And this idea you just mentioned, so I'm hearing my echo. Okay. So you just mentioned sort of this idea of being able to look into people's houses, you know, and homes, which we weren't able to do before, which is interesting. But yeah, let's see if there's anything in the chat box. So Enrique is bringing up the idea of eccentricity. So this is what makes think tanks unique. They need to be in the boundaries of the media, of academia, of policy making. It means they can partner with multiple actors.
But it also puts you at risk. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know, Enrique, if you want to come in and elaborate on that. Yes.
Hi.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, Ajoy.
Hello.
So the idea is that think tanks, this is Thomas Medved, and they exist in the boundaries between different fields. So government, politics, media, civil society, academia, etc. And I think that's their uniqueness. You know, they draw most of their power. It means they don't have to be, you know, proper academics. and follow all the rules of academia. It might push the boundary in what's good enough research, or it means they probably do not have to follow the rules of journalism in how they report or how they provide form opinion, what they write on a newspaper or a weekly column. So they might be able to push some of those boundaries, right? So give an opinion that is probably unsubstantiated or anecdotal. Produce a paper that is not necessarily reviewed, and you don't know if the results are correct, but never mind. Let's put it out there for the purpose of having a conversation. A policy organization, formally speaking, so you can make recommendations, public policy recommendations, without without considering the consequences of that recommendation, to the debate or to expectations, etc. You might make a comment about macroeconomic indicators as an economist in a think tank, and you would not be held accountable for a crash in the markets because of what you said, but you would if you were a central bank governor or a minister of finance. So I think they can play with those limits, but in doing so, they might actually be crossing those those ethical boundaries. Right? They might be putting information out there they know might not be strong enough, but it's part of the job to create a debate. So that was kind of reflection of based on this crossing the boundaries comment that Regine added. But I had another comment about partnerships. Another question about partnerships, more of a question. So I don't know if you want to comment on this first, and then
I have a quick reaction. When you're in the sort of border on the ethical boundary, but you're still complying, but you get accused of not doing that by sort of the new fake news journalism that we see around. So as an example, for example, at the CFR, if we have one donor giving us funding on one area, but then it turns out that what they're doing on something completely different doesn't fully align with our policy recommendations. How do you think think tanks, and with your work, Enrique, with all think tanks, how do you deal with those? How do you deal with those press questions when they come to you?
I don't know. I wasn't prepared to answer questions. No, I think it's a fair question. Actually, I think it's one of the scenarios in the integrity health check that Diversify produced. I think I would follow what Ruth was saying, is try to be as transparent as possible in a proactive way. So I think if organizations understand that, so if the public, and that includes the media, understand that your organization is made up of a plurality of individuals and researchers, that you are not a sort of ideologically cohesive organization, and they'll take the research of one researcher, the recommendation of one researcher, as they are the recommendations of one part of the organization. But I think it takes a lot of work from the organization itself to be public about this, right? You cannot expect every journalist or every NGO advocate or every funder to know you just because you are known. Your brand is known, right? They don't need to know you. They probably know your brand, and then they've assigned your brand to their own idea of a think tank. Yeah. And so if their idea of a think tank is a cohesive, ideologically cohesive body, then that's what you're going to be for them. So you have to make an effort to communicate more than just your outputs. Yeah. But I think to be proactive. Yeah. The question I had, if I can jump in, I've written it there, is outside, and we've written about this in OTT. Ajoy, I think we've discussed this before, but outside of the pandemic, right? These informal spaces cost a lot of money. So large think tanks, mainly in developed countries, some in some developing countries, that have the resources, endowments, large long-term funding, etc. They are able to go to these conferences and these events. They can go to the World Bank meetings, they can go to the COPs, they can spend a lot of time in the coffee breaks, meeting partners, future donors or large organizations they can work with and get more funding. So you have a situation where a small number of organizations that have the resources and the contacts are going to get more resources and contacts than those who have fewer to begin with. And if they make it to to a World Bank spring meeting is probably because the funder gave them a bit of a grant, and they're probably a speaker at one of their events, but they don't have travel money for the drinks afterwards.
Yeah.
Right. And one thing is, for someone from Berlin or from London to travel to DC and then have some spending money for drinks, and other things for somebody from Zambia or from Malawi or from Bolivia to go to DC, and then they might not have that much money to keep up with the drinks as they go around and the networking, the informal. And so that's kind of a question, is whether the system we have right now, that that informal relationship building to some extent is encouraging, maybe unintentionally, but is encouraging a fairly unfair or unequal global, regional, and national research community, where the larger ones take it all and the smaller ones, they have to struggle.
Just to sort of problematize that further or complexify it, this idea of establishing new relationships, it's really hard to do without a really high degree of intentionality, online, that's why these in-person things are so important. I think online engagement really works where you're acting into existing relationships, where you've, perhaps you've worked together before, you've met each other, and then, if you're then going to move online, it becomes much easier. Where you don't really know each other, you're still working each other out, there's something about sort of having embodied conversation, which is you just can't put your finger on it. It's really, really hard.
Yeah. I think in that sense, it was really eye-opening, the winter school for think tankers that OTT organized in February, because the variety of challenges that people from other regions, I've worked mostly in Europe for over a decade, but then seeing what in Latin America you would find as the challenges for a think tank are very different. And I do think there's a few things that can be done. For example, I find that out of the things that ECFR does, trying to include voices from other regions to be more inclusive is really helpful. And you can do that through visiting fellowships, for example. So it's not that you need to steal the staff from these places, but you can do a sort of part-time engagement in which not only you give them a voice in your platform, but you also promote their personal profile and the research, and then that helps that other think tank in maybe in a context that is a bit more difficult, such as in the MENA region, for example. And one key aspect of this is if you are in the privileged position and being in one of those think tanks that can afford the coffee breaks in person, then invite people from these regions. So not only the speakers, but also try to have some of those visiting fellows attend your annual conference. I think those are ways is for us think tanks that have that lag to be including others that might be in a trickier position now, or the same if you've been around for 50 years and another think tank is just starting, but you've done some good work together. I think there is definitely ways of making our work more inclusive. To sort of,
and I guess it's not about thinking that you're representing them, but it's rather creating the space that they can take themselves. And I think that would apply to the local level as well. So, within a country, I can see some think tanks that have most of the resources and most of the contacts already. I guess the question of some funders might be interested in is asking their grantees, what efforts are you making to make sure that other organizations in your country also have access to us, right? You're making it easier for them to meet us. We'd like to meet them. You are our entry point into country XYZ or into sector XYZ, but we'd like to meet others because I can imagine it's very hard for funders to meet new potential grantees, whether it's in their own country or in some other country.
And I see many funders nowadays, they're already promoting this by asking you to partner with certain other organizations. So we have had the case of funders coming to us and saying, we really like your project, but we think it will benefit a lot if you partner with these people. And then we fund the project as a joint effort between the three organizations. So I think that's definitely going to be the way forward. And maybe even after Corona accentuating, expressing that even more and highlighting the need for those partnerships, yeah.
And I'll ask one more question and then I'll go away. But do you see a situation where you might say, yes, we'll partner with X, Y, Z, but give them the money, let them subcontract us?
I don't see why not. I can see how I mean, there is a challenge in which then your reputation is linked to them as well. So if they don't deliver the project properly, then you could be harmed by that. But if it's another organization with who you've already worked and you know that they share the same ethics and values as you and the same working methods, then you could feel pretty confident in doing something like that. Because at the end of the day, you will be part of the project and you trust them and you work with them. It might be a bit tricky when you don't know each other. And I think that's where funders would really have to be careful who they ask you to partner with, because they cannot impose that on you either, because it can harm your organization at the end of the day. So.
That reminds me of some experiences I had in Vietnam. I was doing some research where we found that donors were trying to create these research networks amongst different academies of science and research institutes, which a lot of them were sort of, in terms of a hierarchy, they were sort of at a similar level. And so donors would want to sort of give money to a group of these research centers, but then they would ask for one of them to step up to hold the money. And then that organization would then disperse money to the others. But then by doing that, donors were sort of changing the power dynamics. They were creating a hierarchy, which created a lot of resentment. And so, this organization, they would get an overhead, to manage the money. But then, they would be the ones sort of setting the goals, dispersing the money based on triggers. And I think that created a lot of resentment, frustration, and I think over time, the research work suffered, and the networks and these projects kind of died out. They didn't really go anywhere. So I suppose creating these artificial kind of groups, putting together these groups which wouldn't necessarily work together, and then creating a power sort of dynamic can have sort of unintended consequences, I think.
Especially if that organization that they put sort of at the top tries to abuse the overheads. And if you know the total funding amount and then what you're receiving and what others are receiving, then you make the math, and it can definitely create issues. I've seen that in development projects before my time in a think tank, and it's a very tricky situation to navigate, so I'm not surprised.
But from your experience, have you been in a sort of a consortium of organizations which has been sort of quite forced together, I guess, by a funder? I mean, how does that work? How do you get on?
We've definitely been in that situation. I think that's why what I was saying earlier about having very clear division of labor at the beginning. If you have a super clear document, and it's a bit of a shame because sometimes you work on that and then you don't get the funding. So you could feel like, well, you wasted your time. You spent hours with this other organization detailing how you would do the project, and then it didn't go through. But it's really the only way to avoid issues. We've definitely had issues in which someone asked us to join them in a consortium or in previous jobs that I had. And then if that person is not delivering well, then you get harmed by it. Sometimes even the projects get canceled. I've seen the commission canceling projects because they're not doing well, and you haven't even got to your part of the project. And it already has a harm reputation because your name is on it, even though it hasn't got to your activities. So it's super tricky to navigate. I think knowing who you're partnering with and having a very good plan from the beginning helps mitigate in most cases, but not in all.
I mean, I suppose I'm really intrigued by your answer, because you're talking about, as long as we have a good plan, we can avoid these problems. But from my experience, you can have the best plan, but then plans are there to be pulled apart, and we can't predict the future. Things happen, and you have to deal with them. So I suppose I'm always intrigued. Well, shouldn't we be prepared to deal with the difficulty that we will face, rather than always saying at the end, well, we should have just planned better,
But imagine if you didn't even plan for it, the vast amount of issues that could arise from that.
maybe planning is important, but I suppose it's then the question is, how much time do you spend trying to plan and figure out and clarify, and how much time do you then, because I guess for example in the international development sector, there's a lot of emphasis on adaptive management, or doing development differently. I'm not sure you've come across these concepts, but I think it's kind of this pushback against sort of excessive planning, targets, this idea that things happen in a linear fashion, where A leads to B leads to C, etc. When actually A leads to U and perhaps Z and back to A again. So maybe it's about sort of spending a little bit of time on planning, or as much time as you need, but sort of minimally, and then spending most of the time grappling with getting things done and negotiating and dialoguing and addressing conflict and trying to work together.
I definitely don't agree with, maybe I was misunderstood, when they give you, I find it quite funny when they give you terms of reference with everything that they want you to do, deliverables, outputs, the way that they want it, but then they ask you to be innovative in your proposal. Yeah. That's almost impossible, because they're telling you exactly what to do and how to do it. But I meant more when it's not with the funders directly, but with the core organizations. And I agree, you cannot plan for many things, but if at least you have the base ground sort of clarify between at least the expectations of what everyone can bring to the table and how you would divide the work, I do find that quite helpful. But maybe I'm just lucky with my partner organizations.
Well, I suppose, luck is an important factor, isn't it? Serendipity. We don't often talk about that. Right, so we have some sort of conversation going on in the chat box. Kathleen asks a question: how do you ensure that the research program is actually jointly defined with think tanks from N&S, I guess that's North and South, rather than an afterthought or a condition to get funding? Yeah, I suppose that might have been in response to perhaps the Vietnam example. So yeah, I mean, I suppose maybe just taking it back to your experience, Alba, when you do get a suggestion, from a funder to go and work with X, Y, and Z, I suppose, it's like sort of a friend of mine sort of saying, well, why don't you come and meet my friend because you have a shared interest? I mean, I guess that happens, that happens in usually in small groups, parties and that sort of thing. But yeah, in a formal sense, when you're talking about sort of particular goals, huge amounts of funding, politics, I mean, how does that work out in practice?
I think in practice, you start by agreeing to meet that other person or that other organization, because on one side, you don't want to be rude to the funder suggesting something probably out of goodwill. You do need to check whether this other think tank or organization aligns with your core ideas, and that's quite easy to investigate. You can have a half an hour conversation about latest developments and work that you're doing and start to figure out if that could work or not. And then obviously you need more pieces to fill the puzzle, but I just wouldn't see, if it's a condition to get funding, you definitely need to take the time to get to know them. Don't jump into anything with someone else, if you can avoid it, especially. Between North and South, as I was saying earlier, it can be quite tricky. We see that between all of our offices, but at the end of the day, communication, it's quite key in ensuring that those projects work well.
It's really difficult, isn't it, when there's so much money at stake, for people to really be genuinely honest about whether or not to go on together in partnership. Sometimes you just feel, the dollar signs. It's like, wow, there's all this money, we can't say no, and you try and figure it out and work something out, even though it's not going to work out.
Yeah, but then that's even worse, because you might harm the relationship with a funder that was really willing to invest with you. So that's why, sometimes it's better to really do the homework early on.
Yeah, Jenny's talking about the sort of history of relationship together, so personal and institutional, as it being, I guess, sort of a criteria for whether to go on with a particular organizational partnership.
I always say it's a lot easier to renew a partnership than to find a new one. So when sometimes in think tanks people are like, oh no, well, we upset the donor. No, I mean, you really need to take care of your donors and do proper stewardship, because it's a long-term partnership. It's a lot more worth it than the effort that you might try to put into trying to find new ones in the same amount of time. So, yeah. And alignment on goals, definitely. If you have a partner where your goals are aligned and you share the same values, then it's super important and super valuable for us, at least. Yeah.
I suppose we're talking about goals and values. I suppose there's the formal stuff that we see on people's websites, which sound really great and lovely and cuddly and warm, a bit like a teddy bear. But then, there's the actual, how do actually people get on with each other, and they're often quite different sometimes, Yeah, I mean, I'm using sort of the bear example. Someone used this as an analogy to describe partnerships. On one hand, they can be cuddly and warm like a teddy bear, but on the other hand, they can be fraught, dangerous, risky, a bit like a grizzly bear, the ones you'd find sort of in the forest in Alaska, out there to sort of catch salmon fish. So it's we talk a lot about goals and values and alignment as well, as if we can all sort of align together and have sort of perfect fit. But yeah, I guess I'm sort of seeing the messiness and the difficulty.
At least in Europe, I think the think tank world is still pretty small in a way, maybe compared to the US. And obviously it's such a global continent that people that worked in London for 10 years are now based in Paris or Berlin. I think the mobility of it is quite large. The change of a staff, yes, they go to government for 4 years, but then they might come back to a different think tank. I think the reputation here of think tanks plays a key role. I think knowing when to partner with a different organization, you can sometimes quite easily ask questions around your contacts and networks and get some feedback on how that type of project has worked in the past. So, which is even more of a reason to always be ethical and care about others and try to do successful projects, not to please your funder, but also so that the results of the project are more meaningful for your organization, for the other one that you partner with, and for whatever policy recommendations you're working on.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, we're sort of coming towards the end of our time here. There's a few more comments have just come in. Yeah, Jenny's sort of saying forced funder brokering really worked. Yeah, I was wondering, are there sort of situations where groups of organizations have got together sort of through an organic process and then together come up with an idea and then sort of presented that to a funder? Is that sort of something you've been involved in at all? Or is it usually the other way around?
Yeah, no, I think that happens even more times than the other way around. I think when you see the strong points that someone has that you don't have, and you put those together. So ECFR, for example, it's around 60 staff across the 7 capitals. So we don't have, we have certain capacity issues in some parts. So for example, in polling, we always have to get someone else to do that. Or if it's research and looking at polling results, we might as well partner with someone in many cases. So I think when those happen, sometimes it's a bit easier because you're more aligned on what you're looking for, and then you go to the funder with your project idea. When the funder comes to you and asks you to partner with someone, that's when you really need to get clarity on what each one will do. But definitely there is disagreements and issues, and tackle them, I think, is just a part of our work as well. So in the partnerships team, we each have, it's 4 of us, and we divide the portfolio based on national offices and ECFR programs. And I place great importance on making sure that all of these issues with funders are resolved. I'm not expecting them to never happen. I'm just expecting them to be solved in a way that at the end of the day, no one is going to say something bad about the other if we meet again in 2 years' time, for example.
Well, Alba, thank you so much. You've been really generous. I know I've sort of fired lots of questions at you.
That's what we intended. Thank you.
And you've engaged really well, really generously. So appreciate that. And I guess for those who joined towards the end, I think this is all recorded, so you will be able to watch this in full again in great detail. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. Thanks very much. And yeah, all the best. Take care.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.